Just want to let everyone know this meeting this evening will be recorded. All right, good evening. Welcome to tonight's 221 Mount Auburn Street Riverview Condominiums update meeting. I'm Kristen Kelleher, the Manager of Community Relations. Thanks for joining us. There is expected to be a little bit over 225 people joining us here virtually tonight. We'll begin with a presentation shortly, and then after the presentation, we've set aside some time for a question and answer session. We're going to do our best to answer as many questions as possible. And you'll see there's a Q&A button at the bottom center of your screen. And to be as efficient as possible, given the amount of people joining us here tonight, this is how we're going to be accepting questions. We ask that you hold off from submitting any questions to this until the end of the presentation. We really believe many of your questions will be answered and addressed with the slides. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our Deputy City Manager, Kathy Watkins.
Thanks, Kristen. First, thanks everyone for coming. We can go ahead to the next slide, Jeremy. So I just want to introduce myself. I'm Kathy Watkins, the Deputy City Manager. I think I know many people that are on the call. I've been the Deputy City Manager for about 3 weeks, but was previously Commissioner of Public Works. And I would say have been focusing probably about 90% of my time in the last 6 to 8 weeks on this project. And I think many people know some of the history, but we want to take some time tonight and really go through the history of the project, what sort of led to the city's involvement and really leading us to getting involved in the demolition of the building. Want to provide some details about the structural issues, do a little bit of an overview from the July 10th meeting. So for folks that attended the July 10th meeting that we had that was in person, there's going to be some familiar slides and a lot of overlap, but bear with us as we do have a lot of new people into the conversation. And we're also going to really highlight the things that have been changing and things that have updated since July 10th. And I really just want to say that, this is such a challenging situation, both for the residents of Riverview as well as the neighborhood and particularly the direct abutters. And so it's a super challenging conversation and difficult situation. And then again, I sort of emphasize that some folks have heard this presentation 2 or 3 times, but again, ask for your patience. And also with us tonight, and will be presenting with me is Brooke McKenna, who's our Commissioner of Transportation. And then I would also say we have a lot of staff that have really been engaged with this up to the highest levels, including the city manager, a number of department heads across the city, really helping us work through this situation. So you can go ahead to the next slide. And again, as Krista mentioned, we're going to do Q&A at the end and just make sure we can have time to get through as many questions as folks can. This is an executive summary. It's got a lot of words in it. I just want to say that we wanted to sort of pull together a sort of high-level summary that people can read through. This whole presentation will be shared on the website after tonight's meeting. So I want to take a little bit of a step back and even just talk about the history of the development that's known as sort of Riverview Condominiums. And so the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority, going back to 1958, sort of acquired all of these parcels, created one big parcel for development. And then that was developed by First Realty Company of Boston. Good, next slide. So after CRA, consolidated all of those parcels, they then created the parcel on the left, which is known as the Riverview parcel. And that includes both that front building that is the 9-story building that we're really focused on tonight, as well as the lower Bradbury units that folks talk about. On the right is the parcel that became the city's parcel, and that includes Bradbury Street itself, as well as a little bit of open space there. So there are these sort of 2 parcels that people see and think of. This is an image, we sort of call it the Jetsons image. It shows the architect's view of what the building would be before it was developed, and I think it's a pretty accurate reflection of the image. Next slide. So again, these are the 2 different buildings. So the first one with the yellow star is the 221 Mount Auburn Street. It's the 9-story concrete structure with about 66 units. It is again the focus of tonight's conversation. The blue star indicates the lower rise 3-story Bradbury building that has approximately 14 units. The two buildings share utilities, and they're also part of one condominium association, but the structural issues and concerns are isolated to the 9-story 221 Mount Auburn Street building. The next two slides talk a little bit about what the existing zoning is, and we got a lot of questions during the previous meeting about, what can sort of happen on the site once the building is demolished. And while we are a long way from sort of having a development proposal, we did want to share the existing information. So the entire site is zoned residential, and there's sort of two different pieces of that. So again, the piece in the front where the larger building is zoned residence C2. And that zoning allows multifamily housing up to 7 stories, about 85 feet tall. The back part of the parcel is zoned residence C1, and that allows multifamily housing up to 6 stories above grade if the housing meets inclusionary zoning requirements. And I think that people hopefully have a pretty good understanding. Inclusionary housing means that some of the units are reserved for low to moderate income households. Any housing developments in the city that are 10,000 square feet or greater are required to include inclusionary zoning housing. And then any development that is greater than 75,000 square feet requires special permit approved by the planning board that includes full public hearings. And so we just want to say that, we don't know exactly what's going to happen or what that will look like, but there would be a public process. I do also want to point out the entire site is approximately 2 acres and has currently a little over 100,000 square feet of residential housing. Next slide. So again, we talked a little bit about it's fully residential. We talked about the zoning. Just want to be really clear that there are a lot of nuances associated with development that would be worked through as that development process through the planning board. The site, there is no identified timeline for the redevelopment of the site. Really, as you'll hear as we're going through this, the current focus, and certainly the city's primary focus at this time, is really on protecting public health and public safety. And so that is the primary focus of what we're going to talk about tonight, and also the sort of the primary efforts over the next 6 months. Once the city completes the demolition, the property remains under the ownership of the condominium association. So the individual unit owners would still continue to own that property. They have indicated that they think it will take at least a year to go through the legal process before they are in a position to sell or redevelop the property. So just again, want to lay out that there's a lot of questions about redevelopment, and we're providing as much information as we can, but there's a lot that we don't know yet. And one of the things I do also want to point out is that I think that's true of many different areas. We are really trying to be as transparent and share information as much as we can and as quickly as we can. But that also means that there are a lot of different questions that people have that unfortunately we don't have the answers to at this time. So we're really going to focus now on sort of the structural issues in the building. I think it's become clear to us as we've been meeting very frequently with the direct abutters, and at the meeting we had 2 weeks ago, that there's a pretty good understanding in the community about the fact that this building has issues that need to be addressed. And so these are just some highlighted coverage that provide a high level overview of that. I think the next slide shows that even more recently, as the city's involvement has, as the city has become involved, there's been a lot more coverage. Jeremy Warnick, who's on the helping us here with the logistics tonight, is really our media person, and he said that looking up, there's been over 150 news stories about this building, and so there's been an extensive amount of coverage. This is a little bit of timeline that really shows sort of the work that Riverview Condominiums have been doing since this really started in 2023. And we're sort of going to go through each of these steps. But, back in February 2023, the Condominium Association was doing, necessary repair work and maintenance work on the building and identified issues. And we'll really talk through those. And then, as we talked about in the articles, first identified that there's repair issues. Let's figure out how to repair them, determined that that wasn't possible, really focused on how do we demolish the building, and then really came to the city this late May, early June of this year saying they need help. They know the building needs to be demolished. They don't have the resources and the ability to do that demolition themselves. And so really reached out to the city. And that's when we really became involved. And I would say we've been meeting, 2 or 3 times a week with varying groups about this project to really understand what's going on and what's really necessary, what steps are necessary to be protective of public health and safety. So again, we talked a little bit about 2023. The Condo Association was doing preparatory work to look at roof repair as well as drainage improvements. And so when they were doing that work, they were coring through balconies to do new drainage stacks. When they did that, they encountered rebar. So we talk about structural steel in the concrete, and the rebar was not located where they expected it to be, which raised some red flags of what's going on here. And so at that point, they had SGH, who is, one of the premier structural engineering firms that really specializes in concrete, come in and do a full analysis to say what's going on in the building and, what do we need to do to repair the building. So SGH really went through the entire building, and they did ground penetrating rebar to identify the location of where that steel was and compared it to where it should be. So if you think about, you have a concrete slab that's 8 or 9 inches thick, and that's really providing some of that structural support for the building. The way that concrete slab really gets its full strength is that there's rebar that's also placed within that concrete. That rebar is specified to be at a very specific location. When they did the analysis, they found throughout the building, it was placed about 2 inches deeper than it should have been. So that means it's not providing the structural strength that it was designed to provide. The other issue they found, and again, pretty consistently throughout the building, is what is the strength of the concrete? So we generally talk about concrete in pounds per square inch. And so the building specified concrete to be 3,000 pounds per square inch. When they tested it throughout the building, it was on average about 2,000 pounds per square inch. So again, consistently less strength than was specified, and again, consistently throughout the building. There were some other issues, and again, I would say those are much less severe. So there were, again, utility penetrations have been made over the years and other types of concrete repair. But the most significant issues are really these first two that were construction issues and consistent throughout the building. And so we think about, want to talk a little bit about what does that mean and what are the concerns that that means for the building. So when we think about the building, and again, that concrete slab, it needs to be designed to support all of the weight of the building. And so the weight that you're looking at when you're designing the building is, the weight of the building itself, the weight of the people and their possessions, and then also things like snow load. So if we get a big snowstorm and there's a lot of snow on the roof, that can add a significant amount of weight to the building. So you can go to the next slide. And so again, this is sort of a diagram that shows there are these columns to the building and then these slabs. So we talked a little bit about the slabs that have that concrete strength issue and also that rebar issue. And then there's this connection between the concrete column and the slab. And so that needs to be strong enough to really support all of those different weights that we talked about. And the concern is that if it's not strong enough, you can get what's called a punching shear. And a punching shear failure is a very quick and sort of brittle failure. And so again, if you sort of do the next animation, if you don't have the strength there between the column and the slab, you can get this very dramatic pancake kind of collapse. And so you can lose those columns, and then that can impact the levels below. And so that is the concern that we're really worried about with the building. And so as SGH really went through and looked at the building, did that analysis, there are almost 800 of those column to slab connections, and they've done an analysis of each of those. Their report showed that there's very low to potentially zero safety factor, again, when the slabs are subject to all those code required loads, like the people, their possessions, and the snow. And then they also looked at, okay, well, right now it's not winter and the building's been vacated. And so there's less weight on the building. And even with that less weight, there's still a significant number of potentially dangerous slab to column connections. So again, this is when, the condo association really reached out to the city again, sort of in May, and then we started really meeting in June and really shared the analysis showing the low to zero factor of safety, and again, particularly with that additional snow load, and really identified that the building is over capacity and potentially dangerous. So we've been working with the condo association trying to figure out how does the building get demolished. When the condo association came to the city, the city manager reached out to the governor's office to make sure that we're getting support and information and really collaborating with various state partners throughout this process. And one of the things, I don't know that I touched on quite enough, but the condo association has also gone through a process where they identified that there were these issues with the building and then said, well, obviously your first assumption and your first, move is to repair the building. And so they really went through a process to say, what would it take to repair the building? And with that came up with, it's about an $80 million repair project. And once they really got into the details of it, it became clear that given the structural concerns in the building, it's really not possible to do that level of work in that building. And so it came to the very unfortunate conclusion that the building needed to be demolished. And so, now we're sort of in this moment where it's become clear that the city really needs to get involved, and needs to, really take the lead on this demolition. And so one of the things we're really focused on is how are we reducing risk? And we're talking about risk sort of in two different buckets, so that we have risk between now and the time demolition begins. And then we also have risk during demolition. And so we're sort of going to talk about those two things a little bit different in two different buckets. So the first is between now and when demolition can begin, what can we do to reduce risk? And so people will have seen that the contractor working for the condo association put up additional fencing to really secure the site, to make sure people aren't entering the site that shouldn't be there. They've also been working to disconnect utilities. And the emphasis of that is really, one, we need to disconnect the utilities to begin the demolition. It also helps reduce risk. So it is not great to have gas and water and electricity to an unoccupied building, because if there was a leak or an issue and there's no one there, it could go on and not be identified. And so they're working really to disconnect all of those utilities. So far, gas has been disconnected, electricity to the building has been shut off, and they're actively working on the other utilities. The other thing that the condo associations working with SGH has done is they've done 3 different drone surveys. And so the drone surveys allow an analysis of the exterior of the building to sort of see, are there changing conditions? It's not a full survey of the building. They're not going inside the building, but it is an opportunity to see what's going on outside and identify if there's any changes. And so they're going to be doing those drone surveys every 2 weeks. And then the last one was done on July 9th, and that survey did not identify any substantive changes on the exterior of the building. The next one was done today, and each of those we're getting a report, and we'll be posting those on the website. Again, we're trying to share as much information as possible. The various engineering analysis that have been done have been shared on the website, and these various drone surveys and the results from those are also being shared on the website. The other thing we've been doing, and I would say particularly in the last sort of 3 weeks, have been doing a lot of outreach, making sure that we're sharing the information that we have with the broader community. We had the meeting on July 10th. We had over 80 people in attendance. That was in person. And then we wanted to have a follow-up meeting tonight, again, to make it more accessible so that people that weren't able to attend could come, or people that, were not able to attend in person have the Zoom option. We've also been meeting really closely with the direct abutters who are most impacted by both the current situation as well as during the demolition process. So we've reached out and met with, I think, just about every resident on that first section of Spark Street, the Bradbury Street residents, and then also the condo building immediately to the Harvard Square side of the Riverview. The other thing we're doing is really working to get an experienced contractor on board. And so we know that this type of work is extremely complicated in this dense, very close, tight knit residential neighborhood. And so we want to make sure that we have a good contractor that is prepared to do that work. We've also closed access to the adjacent public streets, and that happened on July 19th. And I think, we've had a lot of questions about why are we closing the streets now, but demolition isn't going to begin for, another couple months. And based on the information we have, again, we were trying to keep people away from the building. We know that people using the public streets don't necessarily understand what's going on, and it's really important for us to keep people away from the building. So we did make the very difficult decision to close both Mount Auburn Street and Spark Streets, as well as DCR closed the one closest lane of Memorial Drive. So I'm going to turn it over to Brooke, and she can really talk through the work that's been done to get those detours in place. And, as I do that, I just want to give an incredible shout out to Brooke and her whole team in terms of all the work that's really gone into this. And while it's been extremely challenging and I know frustrating and difficult for people, it has gone extremely smoothly given the substantial detours that are in place. So I will turn it over to Brooke. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathy. As Kathy said, we recognize that these closures have a really significant impact on folks, both the residents in the immediate area and people who travel through this part of the city regularly. So we did not take it lightly, and it's really all done in the name of public health and safety. So we did put the closures into place last Saturday. As you see on the map on the page right now, in the red dots, you see the area of what we call the hard closure. So that area is now kind of completely closed off with barriers and fencing. And that means it is inaccessible to people walking, biking, or in vehicles. And that does extend down to the first lane on Memorial Drive, as Kathy said. Then the areas in yellow are abutter-only access areas. So that is for folks who live in that area. They're able to go past kind of the initial barriers and have access to their homes. And that goes both for the folks who live in the areas indicated in yellow as abutter only, but also to all of the immediate abutters who are in the red area. We have maintained access for them to their homes as well. So we have done as much as possible in terms of communication to get the word out about these detours, these closures and these detours. So we did reach out to the residential abutters. We worked closely with the hospital and other key city partners. We were lucky enough to get a good amount of media coverage from both local, regional, and national outlets to really get the word out to an even wider audience. We utilized the city's Code Red alert system, as well as email and app emergency alerts from Nextdoor and the Cambridge Police Tip 411 notification system. We had stories on the city's website. We did email mailings and a social media campaign. So you can see photos of some of the samples of some of the alerts that did go out. So here you can see just some samples of what it is looking like out there now. In the lower right hand corner is a picture from a drone of the closure area. You see along the first, the red barriers along Memorial Drive. It's a little harder. You can't really see that, the actual closure is a little bit out of camera range, but you can tell kind of right along the edges of the photo are where the fencing and barriers are in the neighborhood as well. And in the lower left, you can see with the detours in place, the MBTA bus navigating that detour route. And we have a We've added additional signage to make sure that the pedestrian bicycle detour is really clear for folks. That's one of the more challenging aspects of it. And with most construction sites you come across, the street might be closed to vehicles, but you can always get through on foot or by bike. But in this case, because it is a safety issue, we do have to detour the pedestrians and bicycles as well. Now we can go to the next slide. We also reached out and coordinated with the navigation apps, Waze and Google Maps. And we do have the closures in there. And so you can see examples. On the left is Waze, and on the right, if you were to go in and get walking or biking directions, the closures and the detour are reflected in that. The other really important thing about getting these closures into Google Maps and Waze is that they help with kind of the routing of trips, regional trips that are further away from the area. Whereas a couple of weeks ago, if you were traveling from point A to point B, the navigation apps might send you straight down Mount Auburn Street. Now they know that's not possible. And that results in people kind of generally being kept further away from the detour area. And that's a really important part of our strategy, is to try to keep, we want people who are coming to the local area to come and to use the detours, but folks who don't have a local destination, it's better to kind of stay away from the general area. And next slide. So this is the sum total of all of the various detours that we have in place. So when we looked at how we would deal with these closures, we looked at it from a bunch of different perspectives. So of course, we focused on local resident access. How do we get people to their homes during this period, or to other local destinations, such as the hospital? We looked at the bus routes. There are two frequent bus routes along Mount Auburn Street. That's the 71 and the 73. So we did need to detour them. We needed to make sure that hospital access was very clear. We needed to make sure that pedestrians and bicycles could get through with the shortest detour possible. And we needed to make sure that the trucks were not coming to the local area. Brattle Street is a truck restricted route, and that does mean that only trucks with local destinations are allowed to use Brattle Street. So the truck route for through trucks is completely in blue, much further away from the closure area. We can go to the next slide. So just to kind of quickly run through what the different detours are. For local car access, if you were heading out of Harvard Square towards Watertown, you're going to follow the purple line. Coming down Mount Auburn, you take a right on Willard Street, a left on Brattle, and then continue down to Channing Street. If you were, say, going to the hospital, you take a left on Channing, and then continue along Mount Auburn Street. Or if you were going further down Mount Auburn Street, you could just continue straight along Brattle, cross Fresh Pond Parkway, and then join back up with Mount Auburn Street. In the Harvard Square direction, you would follow the green line, which would take you up Lowell Street to Brattle Street, and then back down Hawthorne Street. And then you can continue along Mount Auburn into Harvard Square. We can go to the next slide. This is the bicycle and pedestrian detour. It is the shortest detour, and folks can go up Gibson Street to Foster Street and then down Willard. And then that is the same in both directions, whether you're coming from Harvard Square or coming from Watertown. And so as I mentioned, there are two significant bus routes, and they are following the same detour route as the local traffic. So that's coming out of Harvard Square, they'll go up Willard, down Brattle Street to Channing Street, and then along Mount Auburn. And in the opposite direction, we can go to the next slide, reverse that and go up Lowell Street to Brattle Street, down Hawthorne, and back to Mount Auburn and into Harvard Square. In order to make these detours work as seamlessly as we can, we did make 3 streets into temporary one-way streets. Channing Street is now operating one way towards Mount Auburn Street. Lowell Street is operating one way away from Mount Auburn Street towards Brattle. And then Willard is also operating one way northbound towards Brattle Street. And what you don't see on the map is Hawthorne Street, which was already a one way that operates southbound towards Mount Auburn Street. So we have now 2 one-way pairs for either end of the detour. Again, as I mentioned, Brattle Street is a truck restricted route. So we do have an alternative truck detour for through trucks that starts all the way out at Aberdeen Ave, travels up towards Huron Ave to Concord Ave to Garden Street and back to Mass Ave. And that is the same, that detour is the same, whether you're heading towards Harvard Square or away from Harvard Square. So the only trucks that will use Brattle Street in the local detours are those with local destinations. All right. So this one, you know, we've had the closures in for almost a week now. And, you know, we are happy with the way that it's been going so far. We have been hearing from folks with concerns and questions and comments, and we really appreciate that people have been reaching out to us. We have made some adjustments. We were able to add some time to Hawthorne Street at the Hawthorne and Mount Auburn signal. We're continuing to add signage where needed, and we'll continue to monitor and make more adjustments as we go along. We made a few parking changes, a few parking restrictions to make sure that the buses and larger vehicles could make turns. And then we also converted some 2-hour parking along Mount Auburn Street to resident parking only to make up for some of what was lost with the closure. And as I said, we are continuing to monitor that, and we'll continue to make tweaks as we go along. Folks who live locally might recall that there has been some construction work happening prior to the closure along Mount Auburn Street near the hospital, and that is MBTA work on duct banks in the sidewalk. So that's Newport Construction working on behalf of the T. And we did stop that work this week while we got the detours in place and gave them a little time to settle in. But they will resume that work next week. In this map, you see the small red square is the next work zone where they'll be working. And in pink, you can see the pedestrian detours since they are doing sidewalk work. We were able to add 2 additional parking spaces on the north side of the street near Longfellow Road. That's the bus stop that has been temporarily closed. So we were able to convert that into parking. But we're going to continue to coordinate really closely with Newport on this construction work, and also working very closely with the hospital to make sure that access is retained at all times. So we're going to be monitoring that closely. And with that, I think I will hand things back to Kathy.
Thank you. I was muted. Yeah, so thanks for all the information about the traffic. I want to sort of turn a little bit to, we sort of, and maybe glossed over it a little too quickly, sort of how we've gone from, the condo and now the city is involved. And, as we've worked with the condominium association and their full team of folks, it's, again, become clear that, you can imagine having an 80-unit condo building. It's not easy to figure out, financing and the logistics of demolishing, what is everyone's homes. And so that has been a super challenging situation for those homeowners. And so, again, when they reached out to us, it was they know the building at this point needs to be demolished. Repairs aren't an option. And how do they sort of help navigate that? And so, they reached out to the city. We've done a lot of work back and forth with their consultants, really evaluating the various reports and making sure that that we've sort of confirmed that they've sort of gone through all the process that they can in terms of getting to demolition. And so then we go through, there's a process where in order for the city to be involved and really undertake a demolition on private property, which is not something we take lightly, both in terms of going onto private property and doing work, and then also, spending city funds, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But, there's sort of a process that we follow. And so at the end of June, the Inspectional Services Department, formally notified the owners that the building must be removed and gave them, a deadline for when the building had to be removed, and they indicated clearly to us that they were not capable of doing so. But that sort of starts this process that allows the city to be involved. And then the next step in that process is that the city convened what's known as a board of survey to assess the property. And the board of survey consists of three folks, and it's the fire chief, the building commissioner, the city engineer, and then also an independent structural engineer. So in this case, the city brought in STV, and STV both reviewed all of SGH's work to confirm that they sort of concurred with their analysis. And then the board of survey issued a report, and that was just issued earlier this week, confirming that the building has to be demolished. And again, with the focus on protecting the health and safety of the public. And so with that board of survey report, that is sort of under state law what authorizes the city to again enter onto the property to do the demolition of the building. And again, with the focus on protecting public safety. Earlier this week, yesterday, we had a meeting with the city council to authorize the funds needed to do this work. So on yesterday, city council authorized $20 million to support the demolition. And I would say, it's very clear that city council, one, understands the significant impact on the community and the neighbors in terms of this building and the concerns about the structural safety of the building. And once, it knows that we have the role to play here. And also, is committed to making sure that the city recovers those funds. So once we complete the work and know exactly how much the city has spent on it, we would then recover those costs from the property owners by placing a lien on each of those properties. So there is a process that is in place for one, both for the city to undertake this work, and then also for the city to recover the funds that we've spent on the work. I think, the demolition and how that's going to happen is probably one of the areas where we received the most comments and concerns. And I'd say this is also the area where there's a lot of unknowns. And so, how the building is going to be demolished, exactly like what are the protections that are going to be in place to protect particularly the immediate abutters, but, the broader community as well during that construction. And so those are where I think there's a lot of questions. What I can say is that we're currently engaging to bring on a qualified contractor with experience in this kind of work. We're also engaging with both a structural engineering consultant and an environmental consultant that'll be working directly for the city to both advise us and help us manage the contractor in terms of how do we do this work as safely as we can. And the environmental consultant is a really important piece of this. So one of the things we haven't really touched on is that the building, like I would say pretty much every building of its era, has asbestos in the building. Asbestos is only really a concern when it's, friable. The asbestos in the building is in some popcorn ceilings, tiles, and then a couple other areas in the building. And so when you do a typical demolition project, you would have contractors go in and do abatement and remove all that material in advance. Given the condition of the building, that's not possible. We can't have contractors in the building doing that kind of demolition and removal at all of these locations throughout the building. And I would also say that would add, a significant amount of time into the process and be an unsafe work environment. And so what that means is that the building would be demolished in what's known as a non-traditional demolition. And that's a very specific term that means that it would be permitted through DEP. To ensure that the contractor is putting in measures in place to make sure that they're removing the building, again, as safely as it can be. And so we don't know exactly what that would look like, but I would say that, it's clear that when you're doing demolition and you're looking to control asbestos, you're trying to minimize that airborne material. And so it's really about managing dust. It's about misting. It's about wetting the material and other measures. And so over the next 6 to 8 weeks, we'll really be working through the details of what that looks like, again, with a qualified contractor, with our environmental consultant and our structural engineering consultant. And that work would be permitted through DEP. And so, our team will come up with strategies that they think, are the right ways to approach the building. And then that would really be reviewed and go back and forth with DEP about any additional measures that are necessary to protect public health during the demolition of the building. So we anticipate that, once we get these folks on board, we'd have 6 to 8 weeks for engineering and permitting, and then they would be mobilized on site, and anticipate that the demolition itself would take 12 to 16 weeks. And then the city's role is to come in and demolish that front concrete building, again, focusing on public health and public safety. And then we would make the site safe. And so, that may be made paving it or gravel, making it safe. And then that the city's work would be done. And again, like we talked about before, it would then be back to the condo owners to determine the next steps with the parcel. We would anticipate having a sort of our next community meeting would really be in September, sort of early fall, September. And that's where we would really have the details of the demolition and how that work would be done. And so we do want to be really clear with folks that we would have another similar meeting to this. And again, maybe we do another one in person and another one in Zoom to make sure that we can have as many of these conversations as possible with folks to really talk through the details of that plan, and share those details. Next step. The other thing I'd say is that, between now and September, we're going to continue to be monitoring the detours, making adjustments as necessary. Brooke already talked about some of the things we've been doing in terms of looking at parking changes, signal changes, additional signage. Brooke talked a lot about, we've been meeting really closely several times with the hospital to make sure that their access is maintained, which is critical. And so we'll continue to monitoring those detours, making adjustments. And then we're going to also really be, and Kristen will talk with this, about some of the communication and outreach to particularly those direct abutters and making sure we're in close contact with them and then sharing information. And we talked a little bit about the demolition. I think it's important. Some folks have raised some concerns about, who's managing the demolition, how will that be done? I just want to be really clear that the city staff and our contractors will be managing the demolition. And then again, once the demolition is complete, the property goes back, it goes back to the care and control of the owners. And then we're also in the process concurrently would be seeking repayment from the owners of that funds, that whatever funds we spend on the demolition. And Kristen, you want to talk a little bit about even on the next past slide or either one, about sort of communication efforts, what people can expect from us.
Sure. I know many of you have already done so, but if anyone has not yet gone to the project page, we highly encourage it. As Kathy mentioned, we're consistently posting data and documents as we get them. When you go to the project page, there'll be an area on the contacts tab where you can sign up for email notifications. And just as early as immediately prior to this meeting, I uploaded the Board of Survey and the latest drone report from today. So you can go to the Documents tab and you can find those in a number of other reports we had previously put up. There's currently a document up there called FAQs, and this document so far has some frequently asked questions that we've been receiving through a number of avenues, and we plan to update that regularly. So if you keep checking, that's on both the latest tab and the Documents tab. And so far, a lot of people that have reached out have said that's been very useful, and it really answers a lot of the questions that you might have. So I would take a look at that. If that doesn't answer your question, you can also at any time feel free to reach out. My email address and my phone number are on the screen there. The next time we'll meet for a community meeting similar to this one will be in September. And I think at that meeting, we'll have a lot of the answers to the questions that a lot of you have in regards to the detailed schedule for demolition, the plans, and the approach of how it will actually be done. We don't have that date yet to share with you, but as soon as we do, sign up for the email notifications and we'll let you know, but that will be in September sometime. And again, this just again has the project website. We strongly encourage you to sign up for the email list. We did distribute paper flyers again for this meeting, but going forward, we're really going to rely on the email notifications for most of our communication. So finally, the time everybody has been waiting for, the Q&A. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen in the center, the Q&A button. You can click there and enter your questions. I just want to really stress we have a limited time, so we're going to answer as many questions as time allows. But if for some reason you have concerns after this meeting or you feel your question wasn't addressed, you can reach out to me and check that FAQ document because there is a chance it could be in there as well. If you're unable to submit your question using the Q&A box, you can feel free to give me an email or a phone call, and I'll be also monitoring that. All right, so we'll jump right in here. Kathy, we had a couple people ask if a second engineer was hired to review that SGH report.
Yeah, so there's a two-piece answer to that question. So one is that the condo association, when they got the report, hired Thornton Tomasetti to do a peer review to make sure, right? Because this is a big decision for them in terms of understanding the magnitude of the issue. So, and I do want to reiterate again, sort of going back that the condo association, from everything we can have seen, has taken every step that they can to be responsible property owners in terms of starting with maintaining the building as well as hiring really good consultants to work with them. So that initial SGH report, they had a peer review done for their own benefit. And then once they came to the city, we also hired STV, who's a very capable consulting engineering firm on behalf of the city to also review those documents to make sure that the city's interests were protected and that we had another set of eyes on it. And again, somebody with a specialty in structural engineering. So I would say that we've had at least two different folks do peer reviews of that first report.
Thank you. Another concern is if the taxpayers of Cambridge are paying for these expenses in the guarantee of repayment.
Sure. And in yesterday's part of the appropriation, there was, a little bit of information in there, and we can add some more details to the FAQs. But there is a process under state law where, again, this is an extraordinary step for the city to take to come in and spend, tens of millions of dollars on a private property. But so state law gives us the authority to do that. It also gives us the authority to lien the property. And it's similar to a tax bill. So we would lien their property similar to a tax bill such that the property owners are responsible for that bill. And then, in this case, it is quite likely that the property would ultimately be sold. Again, that's up to the condo association to sort of work through that process. If it is sold because it operates like a tax lien, we would be sort of first in line to be repaid. And so we've gone through this process and we are sort of putting out a significant amount of city resources, but there is a mechanism in place to get those funds paid back to the city.
Thanks. Will residents be able to do their own monitoring of air quality? And will the city provide monitoring devices?
So again, residents can sort of take additional steps. I would say that, through the DEP process, I did not talk about this, so it's a good question. We focused on sort of the misting and reducing the dust. It is also typical of this type of construction that there would be extensive air monitoring that would be done. And again, that would be done by one of our other consultants, not the contractor, so that we have sort of a checks and balances. So exactly what that plan looks like, we would need to determine. And again, look at it both in terms of with our environmental consultant as well as with Mass DEP, who is really the responsible party in terms of permitting this type of building work and asbestos.
A number of people noticed, we've said a couple different times, once a contractor is on board, and they're curious when that is going to be.
So I would say, it's a little tricky in that we're currently in the negotiating process. We anticipate that we're moving as quickly as we can. We did get approval from the state, and this is an important piece, to not go through a traditional full bidding process because we made a very clear argument to the state that this is an emergency situation. If we were to go through sort of a traditional bidding process, that would add easily 3 to 6 months into the process. So we do not have to go through that. And so it's a matter of weeks, not months, in terms of getting those folks on board. And so we don't have, again, this is like, I think in 2 or 3 weeks, we'd have a different answer. And, hopefully people have seen there's been some significant updates even since 2 weeks ago. And so I'd say this is a similar one, which is we're actively working on it. And I would say it's a matter of weeks, not months.
And related to what you were saying about the demolition, are weather considerations taken into place when there's certain weather that can release the materials and conditions that would increase that risk for abutters?
Again, I don't have a full answer to that question. I'd say in terms of weather, one of the biggest concerns is, at least beginning demolition. We may not be completed demolition, but at least beginning the demolition before we get snow. I think one of the things that really pushed the condo association to reach out was as they were looking at their timeline, realizing that they would not be able to get this building demolished before winter. And so we are working as expeditiously as we can to get this project underway. Because I think, when you think about demolition, every piece that you take down sort of reduces the risk, right? And so the more we can get down before we get a heavy snowfall, the better off we are. And so I'd say the big weather concern we have is, getting demolition substantially underway before we have a significant snowfall.
Thanks. Another question that's come in several times is if the city is investigating the firms that seem to have built this building.
So we are not. So that's really up to the condo association in terms of, I mean, they're ultimately the ones that are, have a building that is damaged, and what does that look like? And, it's now 60 years later. And so I think there's some real questions about what that looks like. But, that's really a question for the condo association and, their partners. But from the city's perspective, again, going back to state law, we have the authority to do the demolition. We feel like it's necessary. Again, we do not take this step lightly, but we do think it's necessary for the city to be involved for public health and public safety, and then, put liens on the property so that we can recover our funds. And then it's up to them in terms of, they're trying to recover their losses.
Related, do you know if there are any other city buildings that were built in the same manner by the same firm?
I do not know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Is the city lien, we have a lot of questions about the lien process. Is the city lien written in such a way that the city must wait for each owner to sell their property?
I think it's done a couple different ways. So it can be, against the individuals. And I think we didn't really talk about this, but, in these types of situations where you have, 80 different unit owners, what you would typically expect is they would go through a process at land court to sort of dissolve those individual, like I own my condo and you own your condo. Instead, like we jointly own this property. I own 2% and you own 2%. And so I would say our legal team is working through that process to make sure that the city is protected in a couple different ways. And so that is also work that is ongoing. And I'd say that is concurrently ongoing with us getting contractors involved and engaging in the demolition work. So that work isn't slowing down the ultimate demolition work.
Is the city considering builders and developers to file a bond that covers risks associated with situations like this going forward?
In terms of new construction,
Hmm.
I mean, new construction needs to be permitted, and it's like they have building permits. I go back to like, the city has a role in terms of there's a building permit process, and people need to submit building permits. It needs to meet code. Build construction is, overseen by the private developer and the private owner. And similar, like if you're doing work in your kitchen, it's really up to you to manage that work. The building inspector, they do certain inspections, and so there is a role there. Just again, this is not one that's come
Yep,
up, so I apologize. And I think this might be one that we're sort of better able to pull in some other folks and do an FAQ on this one because I don't want to give
that's
misinformation.
okay.
So let me
I'll give,
stop there.
we'll go to an easy one. Will the city be doing any surveys and photos of the immediate abutters of the building?
Yeah, so one of the things, and we do this typically with large scale construction, is that there would be a pre-construction survey done of the immediate abutting properties. And so the contractor would be required to hire, an independent firm that would go in and do documentation of the conditions, both on the outside and the inside of those immediate adjacent properties.
I can answer the next one. If we know yet who will be the point person for any urgent concerns from abutters that arise during the demolition, And I think Kathy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but once we have a team on board, I will still be involved in the process, but we will also have a point person that is on the ground that will also be shared with you once they're on board.
Yeah, to Kristen's point, so our capital buildings department would be the department managing the construction. And so they would have obviously a construction manager on site, and then also Kristen would continue throughout this process to really support their community relations and outreach to folks. And so again, she's always a good place to start. And then, she pulls in the rest of us as needed to answer those questions.
Kathy, do you know if once an environmental consultant is on board, do you know if they'll also publish their monitoring plan, equipment location, and any real-time access to the monitoring data?
I don't have the specifics of that, but I would say those are the specifics that we would have at the September meeting. So, and we would have that before construction begins. So we would have, here's what the plan is. And again, I think this is an area where anytime, people, any questions that people have, it's helpful for us to hear, right? Because that's helping to inform how we're undertaking this work. But in September, we would have those kinds of details about what's the air monitoring, how that's being done, and how that's being managed.
Is the environmental consultant a part of the $20 million appropriation?
Yeah, so if I can just talk a little bit about the $20 million, and we talked a little bit about this at City Council yesterday, is that, it is our hope that this doesn't cost $20 million and that, we're being, I think it's a conservative estimate to make sure that we have the funds in place to take those necessary precautionary measures so that as we're going through construction, we can make the right decision for this project. That cost covers both the demolition contractor, as well as the structural engineer that I spoke about, the environmental consultant that I spoke about, the traffic management associated with it, the air monitoring, and any other kind of protective measures that are put in place. So all of that is incorporated into that $20 million.
I just want to let everyone know we're getting quite a few questions about the air monitoring, and I think that we answered for tonight as best we can, and we will have more details for that once we have that environmental consultant on board in some future conversations. Brooke will share the wealth. Are Apple Maps included?
Oh.
It's a good question.
Yes, the closures are in Apple Maps as well.
Wonderful. We have a couple questions about going back to costs. What about the costs of police details in relation to both the detours and the future demolition?
Yeah, so that is also being tracked and would be part of the expenses that the city would be looking to recover. So again, we're trying to really track. And again, I want to emphasize we're being mindful of not spending money we don't need to spend, but the expenses that we do incur that come to the city, we would look to recover from the condo owners, including police details.
Brooke, do you know if the Memorial Drive project that was planned will be affected by this?
So we don't know yet. We have been coordinating really closely with DCR. They've been a great partner in getting ready to do the closures. And their plan was to get together with the contractor that they are getting on board for the phase 3 project and to get answers to those questions, but we don't have them as of yet.
While I have you, are you monitoring how traffic flow might need to be adjusted at the intersection of Brattle and Mount Auburn west of Fresh Pond Parkway?
We are. We're really looking at the entire detour route, including where Brattle Street meets back up with Mount Auburn, heading towards Watertown. So we are looking and seeing how things are going and making adjustments as needed.
We have whoever asked the question about where the workers will park, whether or not they'll be in the neighborhood streets or bust into the work site. Do you want to speak to that, Brooke?
I think that is a question that comes up for every construction project in the city. And I think it's something that as we move forward, getting the contractors on board, it's something that will be worked through, but we don't have those answers yet.
And one of the things I would just add to that, Brooke, is that this is a large construction. It's a costly construction. It is one that is not going to have 100 employees, construction workers on it. So I do also just want to be mindful of, there will definitely be construction workers. And one of the things we'll be working with the contractor on is their sort of staging and phasing projects, including, where do they have employees? But this is not one that I would expect an overly large amount of actual workers on site on a daily basis.
This is one we might not have had to do yet, but someone is asking if we have yet or plan to communicate with the Eastern Bus Transportation Company that CPS provides the buses of, because there's many students that utilize Sparks, Mount Auburn, Brattle come September 2nd.
Yes, now that we have the detours in place, we're going to turn ourselves towards coordinating with, one thing I didn't mention during the presentation was, that typically when we make a big change like this, the first week is difficult, and then things calm down. We were I won't say lucky with the timing of this, in that this is a very quiet time of the summer. But we do anticipate that when September comes and folks are, changing up their schedules to get back to school, we'll probably see an uptick in traffic based on that, because we do, no matter what, every fall. So we have that in mind, and we're planning for that. And a big part of that is going to be making sure that we're coordinating with the public schools, with the private schools, with the bus operators, with the universities that run shuttles, and really every other kind of operator that will be impacted by that. We did as much outreach as we could prior to the implementation to those groups. And then now we're really turning our eyes to the folks who are really going to be impacted come September.
Brooke, will the police details remain at these critical intersections to override lights and such, or will this, once everyone is adjusted, will that?
We anticipate, we wanted to make sure that we were covering all the bases at the very beginning, but we're already seeing that things are operating well, even without the details in place. So we anticipate that we will be kind of, titrating down a little bit with the details. And we're working closely with the police department on that to determine what's necessary, which ones can we stop. But again, we then anticipate ramping up again for a bit at the beginning of September as people adjust to their new school schedules.
Kathy, can you speak a little bit to the threshold that we're looking at to determine that the building is at risk of collapse before it's demolished?
Sure. Yeah. And we did not get into this. And it's been so hard. I feel like Brooke and I have gone through this about 15 times in the last few weeks. So I genuinely apologize if we sort of go through things, because as we've been meeting with different groups, we've sort of gone through this a number of times. But the way the work is done is that, and again, I'm not the detailed structural engineer, but I can give the broad answer, which is that, they're doing an analysis that's based on code. And so based on that, they get a demand to capacity ratio. So you can imagine that you want the demand, which is how much weight there is, to be less than the capacity of the building. And so these are all calculated numbers based on code requirements. And so in an ideal world, you would have your sort of demand equals your capacity, right? And then building code sort of in the concrete requirements specify that if the demand is greater than the capacity, and again, this is a calculated capacity, that you need to go in and make modifications, really shore up the building, provide extra supports. And then there's a threshold that if it's over 1.5, that it's identified as potentially dangerous. And again, that's language from the building requirements. And so they've identified a number of these. And again, it's that slab to column connections that are potentially dangerous. And, it's really, and it's a very, we like certainty. I'll just say for myself, I like much more certainty than we have an analysis that shows potentially dangerous. And what does that mean? And we don't have a great answer to that. What we know is that based on the building code, based on those calculations, it's potentially dangerous, and the potentially, this punching shear kind of failure. But, we'll have people that say, well, the building, has been there. Is it really at risk? Or what does this mean? And it's hard to know that. We don't have a probability. We know that it is, again, potentially dangerous as calculated. And we're doing we're moving as expeditiously as we can to get to demolition. And it's important to do that in a thoughtful, planned way, because demolition is also, a pretty challenging operation in terms of making sure we're demolishing that building and again reducing risk throughout each of those steps. So again, it's that calculated piece. There's pieces on the website, the sort of the bigger report that really went through initially, and then again some additional um, analysis that we asked the consultants to do to really show how much, where are those locations and what does that look like.
You actually did a good job of answering. A couple people were wondering if it is so imminent, why aren't we taking it down right this minute? But I think you did a good job of just explaining how we're moving as quickly as we can, but thoughtfully, and there is a lot that goes into it.
Kristen, I mean, the one thing I would add to that is it's absolutely, it is true that we are being thoughtful and methodical about this. And again, not going through a typical bidding process, bringing people on as quickly as we can. They're already starting to work on sort of thinking through how to demolish the building. But we want to make sure that as we're demolishing it, again, that is another sort of, and again, I talk about risk, but that is another sort of moment of we need to be thoughtful about how we are doing the demolition, how we're protecting public health, how we're managing the dust, how we're managing asbestos. And so we don't want to go into that without having really been having the right folks really get into the details of how to do it and do it as safely as possible. So that is a really good question. And it's a logical one too, in terms of why aren't we out there tomorrow? But you're sort of balancing these two different risks of, something could happen to the building and versus something, if we start going in there and people haven't really thought through the demolition, we could be doing more harm than good. And so you're trying to balance those two different risks.
Thank you. Brooke, will there be any changes planned to Garden Street and Appleton Street to accommodate the situation?
We are not planning any changes. Some people have raised the issue of the left turn restriction off of Brattle onto Appleton. And we did look at that, but having the stop signs and no left turns is actually the best way to facilitate the detour. If we were to allow left turns, it would mean more delay on that route as the left turning vehicles would need to come to a stop and then wait for both a break in vehicular traffic, a break in bike traffic, and pedestrian traffic. So it's much preferable for the flow of the detour, especially because that left turn is very close to Lowell Street. So it's really important to keep that moving and not add delay there.
Thanks. Are there any new 71 and 73 bus stops to replace the ones that are no longer on the bus route?
We have not added additional bus stops. Part of the reason why the detour is where it is to keep the bus lines as close to the hospital as possible. So we do have, the stops that are closest to the hospital, as close to the hospital as possible, as feasible. It is not possible to have any stops on Brattle Street in the kind of Watertown direction because of the two-way bike lane. So we have not added any stops along Brattle Street. But I would love to hear feedback from folks if that is causing problems.
Thank you. Whoever asked about what the route will be for the trucks moving the debris off the site, that's again something that we would be better off answering in September once we have the full team and contractor on board. Let's see.
The other thing I would say to that, Kristen, is, and again, that is one of the how they're phasing the work is really important, and obviously the truck routing is a part of that, and so that is something that we will be looking very closely at it again to make it as efficient an operation as we can, and again reduce risk and have it be as safe an operation as we can.
A few people are asking if we still have a targeted completion of work before the end of the year.
Again, I don't have the detail to that. Our focus is really getting this demolition begun, and so we have some work to do before we can answer that. I think our goal is to sort of continue to move forward, have this sort of timeline start ticking on. Let's getting into the the design and the permitting process. And again, I think in September we'll have a much better detailed schedule.
Thanks. Probably one of the tougher questions of the evening. If there were to be a scenario in which the building did unexpectedly collapse, what would the city's response be?
Um, I mean, I think there's a couple different answers to that. So one is just like any, emergency kind of situation, we would have emergency response respond. And so one of the things we're doing in terms of reducing risk is that there aren't people occupying the building. The building has been marked, as sort of with the X's that it's not occupied. And so the fire department knows that if there is an incident there, they're not expecting people to be in the building. And similar with any kind of demolition, any kind of unexpected collapse situation throughout anywhere in the city, they would be looking to manage dust and reduce risk through that way as well.
Thank you. So this has come in a few times, Kathy, of our classification of immediate abutters. Um, some feel that that excludes some residents that are in the area, and they're curious if the resources such as the building surveys will be extended all the way to Foster Street.
I don't know that answer yet. I think that's one of the things, again, when we are doing the planning with, both the consulting firms and the contractor, understand the sort of the full area that they feel like should be done. I can say clearly that it needs to be direct abutters, but if it needs to go farther than that, and again, that would be sort of based on experience with other sort of similar demolitions, we would have more details about that. So I can say it would definitely include the direct abutters, and then how far beyond that we'd need to really, again, we'd have more information about that later.
Have you been in discussion or have any plans for discussion with Harvard? I know a lot of their graduate housing is over there, and someone pointed out they have, which you're very familiar with, the tot lot playground, and maybe doing closing that off possibly while the demo is happening is their question.
Yes, I think the housing folks are talking about is Shaler Lane, and Chris and I are sort of smiling at each other because we just went through a process where there's a small little tot lot there that we just upgraded the equipment that had been quite old and dated and in serious disrepair, and so the Public Works is just completing that project now. And again, I think, we need to understand, we don't have any plans at this point. We would get, recommendations from the demolition contractor and DEP in terms of, are there those kinds of steps that we should be taking? But at this point, we don't have any of that we don't have a plan or, details about that.
I'm not sure if this is a question that we know the answer to or if we need inspectional services, but do we require the buildings in the city to, on a certain amount of time, to check their buildings conditions periodically?
I would say this is one we should follow up in the
Follow up.
FAQ.
Okay.
So yeah, I think there's a couple ISD questions that I'm not fully prepared to answer, and I apologize. But our building inspector, building commissioners on listening in, and we can follow up and put that in as part of the FAQs as well.
I think we'll also have to follow up on whether this will impact the head of the Charles. That's
Yeah, I can say that
something.
we've already been talking in terms of traffic impacts and what does that look like. I don't think anyone's proposing that we're canceling the head of the Charles, but in terms of traffic impacts, and I don't know, Brooke, if you have any thoughts about detours or signal changes, or again, that might be another weekend where we want to need to bring in more detail officers to try to help manage sort of knowing that sort of spike in traffic that weekend.
Exactly. And like I said, we've been working really closely with DCR, and we'll continue to do that, especially around the special events in the fall and around the Sunday closures as well.
That was my next one, Brooke. If the Memorial Drive pedestrian closures, do you think they'll continue?
I mean, we don't have any indication that they won't, but again, as we go into the demolition process, we're going to know a lot more at that point, but we don't have any indication that that will change right now.
And they're continuing. I mean, last week it was open and well received. So
Yeah.
again, that would be a pretty dramatic change. But so for again September, and I hate keep saying come back in September, but there will be a lot more details that we'll be able to know about the actual demolition process.
Someone asked how much control the city will have over the contractor in regards to issues like start time, truck routes, etc.
So we're part, it's our contract, and so we will manage it. And I would say, typical work hours are sort of 7 to 4, Monday through Friday. I think we would work with a contractor, and that would be our expectation. But I can also say that if a contractor says, "Oh, if we do this differently, it'll be a safer or a quicker operation," that's something we need to consider. But typical construction hours, are sort of 7 to 4, Monday through Friday.
Will the city be providing any financial assistance to neighbors who need to move out due to health and safety concerns?
And this is, during demolition, I don't know what that looks like yet. And so again, that hasn't come up yet, and we're continue to sort of talk through that. And yeah, again, I don't want to keep saying September, but it really is in September. We'll know more about what to expect during demolition.
Brooke, a couple have asked where guests of abutters can park on those abutters only.
Sure. So if you think back to the map we have with the closure, we have the section that is red and the section that is yellow, and the yellow is abutters only. In that area, that area is open to abutters, to visitors of abutters, to delivery people, to tradespeople. Anyone who is trying to access that area is welcome to do so, welcome to use the parking just like they can now. So if you live in that yellow area or in the red area, your guests can continue to use your visitor pass just like they always have.
Thank you. Someone said they're not a direct abutter and they only heard about this through word of mouth. And how do we plan to inform nearby residents who don't have social media? Which I think is a great question. And for us, we try to do a number of means for communication, so we don't stick to just one mean. I know I really stressed the email and the social media and the technology because, of course, that actually is a great a great resource for us. But as you may have received, we do still canvass the neighborhood with paper flyers. You'll see we have A-frame kind of sandwich boards that we have signage in, um, and a number of different ways that we'll still reach out to you. So we will not limit it just to the social media and the Nextdoor app, although those are definitely tools that we do utilize.
And Kristen, I think the two other quick things I would add is like not social media, but the city does do a daily email update that I think has been incredibly popular. And I don't know, Jeremy, if you have have any numbers off your top of your head about how many people receive that, but that is a great resource in terms of any kind of broad updates in the city. And then also, okay, I'm getting text about Jeremy saying 17,000 people. So it is a great resource. And so I really encourage folks to sign up for the daily email. If you go to the city's main webpage page at cambridgema.gov, you can sign up for it there. And then, Kristen, we also talked about on the website at cambridgema.gov/221 Mount Auburn Street, you can sign up for email notifications. And so, again, we talked about in September, we'll do another community meeting. Anyone that has signed up on that email will receive an email notification about that. And if there's other updates that we're not necessarily having a meeting, but we want to continue to update people, we will be sending out emails to folks as well.
Kathy, we're running, we only have about 10 minutes left, so we'll try to get to a couple more. Will the demolition take into account the risks that might cause to such a historical neighborhood?
And I'm not exactly sure
I
the
know it's
detail there. So I think, the demolition is, will be focused on, again, and I say this too many times, and yet I can't say it enough about protecting health and safety. And so that's both people and the adjacent buildings. And so we talked about, the pre-construction surveys for, again, absolutely those immediate abutters, but then, broader than that, we'll see what is recommended. And that is similar to any neighborhood that we would do this kind of work in terms of minimizing the risk to folks.
Do we have any plans to evacuate the buildings to the immediate left and right of the Riverview?
We do not have any plans. I mean, we've been sharing this information as broadly and really proactively have been in contact with folks, setting up meetings, making sure that people have all the information we have in terms of, sort of the city property and their responsibility. We have, you know, are keeping people away from the building there. We're sharing the information with those direct abutters. It is a really challenging situation. And, we had a meeting, again, in all of these meetings that we're having with folks, this is a very unsettling time for folks. And I think all of us wish that we had crisper sort of answers and sort of more clarity about what this means. But there's no plans at this point to do additional evacuations beyond that immediate building.
Thank you. Brooke, could you just speak a little bit to how the detours have impacted ambulances to Mount Auburn Hospital?
Sure. So we've been working really closely with both the hospital itself, as well as with the Cambridge Emergency Communications, Pro Ambulance, the fire department, just making sure that they have all the information that we have. We've also made arrangements with the hospital for ambulances to have a second access off of Jerry's Landing Road. So it's something that we're monitoring closely and have been doing a lot of information sharing, and it seems to be working well so far.
Thank you. Let's see. A few have asked me if they'll be allowed to see the questions that were submitted, and so you'll see the ones that were answered, and then we'll do our best after the meeting to go through them and kind of summarize the themes that we're hearing. A lot of you do have themes in the same questions, so we'll do our best afterwards to incorporate those into a response. As far as the demolition time, Kathy, are we looking at days or weeks or months? Someone asked once it begins.
Sure. So the estimate, and again, this is a very broad estimate, and we'll know more in the fall, but, we're anticipating sort of 6 to 8 weeks of, really design and planning. And then 12 to 16 weeks is sort of a rough estimate of the construction, the demolition process.
Thank you. And Brooke, I know you talked about the buses a bit earlier, but there's still some confusion amongst the crowd. Will the 71 and 73 buses be stopping on their detour on Brattle Street?
So originally we had not planned to add stops on Brattle Street, but I see this feedback and I will take it to the MBTA and have a discussion with them about adding a Harvard Square bound bus stop on Brattle Street. It is not possible to add outbound stops on Brattle Street because of the two-way bike facility on the north side. There's no way to safely have the bus stop there. So, but I am going to look into seeing what we can do about adding one for the Harvard Square bound direction.
Great, thank you. Right. Kathy, do we have anyone dedicated to support the residents of Riverview who have been displaced due to this?
Yes, I mean, the interesting thing, and again, we want to back up a little bit. So the Riverview, the main building was evacuated in December of 2024. So they've been evacuated for quite some time. And I think we did have some, collaboration with them and see if there was city resources that we could help with as people were trying to identify places to move to. So all of those folks were evacuated the main building back in December of 2024. The lower rise units were just evacuated early July of this year. And again, that was in terms of the two buildings are connected by utilities. And so in order to begin the demolition and again, reduce risk during this time, the utilities are being shut down. And so those folks had to be evacuated. And so we have not received any specific request in terms of helping those folks, but we're certainly, been trying to be supportive of people throughout the process.
In regards to the monitoring that we've mentioned and the ongoing analysis, if that began to show an increased risk, would we then consider evacuation of any residents?
So again, through the Usually the air monitor would be during the demolition process. And so the way that works is that there's sort of triggers that are set and says, if this happens, then what do you do? And again, exactly what that looks like, we don't know at this point, but we'd have that information in December and September where, and again, and this is really working with our environmental consultant that specializes in this kind of work, as well as Mass DEP, that I just want to really emphasize is the permitting agency for this type of work.
Sorry, I wasn't clear. The drone monitoring
Oh, I'm
of
sorry. The
that's okay,
drone. Oh, I apologize. You
of
said air
the,
monitor. Okay.
sorry, of the
No, that's
I have
okay.
air monitoring on the mind, on the brain.
That's all right. The drone monitoring. Yes. So one of the things we're looking at is, and again, we're doing this every 2 weeks. And, again, we've got a report today that the one 2 weeks ago, is sort of, as expected, not significant changes. If we were to see significant changes, then that would be an indication something else was going on. And then we would take appropriate steps. And what that looks like, I don't know because it depends on what we see. But I do want to just say that, we are looking at that regularly. And having the consultants really look at it and understand what's going on.
Thank you. We're nearing the end of our time here. Do you have anything else you'd like to say to the crowd, Kathy or Brooke?
Sure. I mean, I would like to just close and say that I really appreciate everyone's time tonight as well as previous meetings, and also know that the city is really committed to working through this process. And again, I want to go back to being really transparent, sharing information. This is a very, I want to say, uncomfortable position for us in terms of we'd like to have much better answers and have much better, be able to be better assuring people about the situation. But I do want to just say that like the city, across all city departments is really spending significant effort on this, understanding the importance of getting this work underway and doing it. And again, protecting public health and safety, reducing risk to folks. And so we are all committed to working through this process and really encourage folks. We're going to, as Kristen said, be updating the FAQs, pulling in, the information from tonight's meeting, as well as other emails and pieces that we're getting from folks. And again, continue to reach out to us. And again, have a little grace if we don't have the answer, but know that we also want to continue to hear those questions so that we can sort of be working to answer them and also using those questions to understand and, help inform our future work. And so again, I really appreciate everyone's time and just genuinely feel for both the residents of 221 Mount Auburn and the Bradbury units that have evacuated their homes, as well as the immediate abutters that are really living with a very uncertain situation. So again, I really appreciate everyone's time, and please reach out to us with any questions or concerns, and we will do our best to keep people up to date. And again, I can't emphasize enough to make sure you're signing up for the email updates on the website, and then also checking the FAQs, because as we're getting questions in, we will be continuing to update those both tonight and then also moving forward. So really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.